From the thunder of revolution to the roar of invading armies,
In
this
1922,
epic
the
documentary
Soviet
traces
Union
the
was
dramatic
formed.
rise of the Soviet state from the fires of 1917 to the brink of annihilation in 1941. In the Soviet Union Part 1, Red October to Barbarossa, we journey into one of the most transformative and turbulent periods in modern history, a story of ideology, ambition, fear, sacrifice, and power on a scale the world had never seen. The story begins in 1917, when the Russian Empire, exhausted by war, poverty, and political decay, collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The February Revolution toppled Tsar Nicholas II, but it was the Bolsheviks, led by the relentless and visionary Vladimir Lenin, who would seize the moment in the October Revolution. In Petrograd, armed workers and revolutionary soldiers
In the
stormed
aftermath
key
of World
government
War II,
positions,
the
marking
Soviet
the birth
Union
of what would
emerged
become
as a
the
new
Soviet
global
experiment.
superpower.
What followed was not peace, but civil war, a brutal struggle between red and white forces that would determine whether Marxist ideology would survive or be crushed. Through famine, foreign intervention, and unimaginable hardship, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious, laying the foundation for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1922. But victory brought new challenges. Lenin's death in 1924 triggered a fierce power struggle
In
within the Communist Party.
1917, the Roman
Out of the chaos rose Joseph Stalin, calculating, patient, and utterly determined. While rivals like Leon Trotsky advocated for permanent revolution, Stalin consolidated authority through political maneuvering, alliances, and ruthless purges. By the late 1920s, he stood unchallenged at the helm of a vast and fragile state. Under his leadership, the Soviet Union embarked on one of the most radical transformations in human history. Through sweeping five-year plans, rapid industrialization, and forced collectivization of agriculture, Stalin sought to drag a largely agrarian society into the modern industrial age within a single generation. The cost was staggering. Millions perished during collectivization and the devastating famine that followed, particularly in Ukraine. Entire classes of people were labeled enemies of the
Russian
state.
Civil War.
The Great
He was
Purge of
another
the
figure
1930s
who truly
unleashed
established
terror across the
himself
nation as
during the
party
fighting.
officials, military leaders, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were arrested, exiled, or executed. The Gulag system expanded into a vast network of forced labor camps stretching across the frozen wilderness. Yet at the same time, factories rose from empty fields, steel production soared, and new cities were carved from the steppe. The Soviet Union became an industrial power capable of rivaling the West, a
A series
transformation
of
built
strokes
on
would
both
render Lenin
ambition
unable
and
to
blood.
speak, and a new leader
As
would
Europe
soon
drifted toward another catastrophic war, the Soviet Union stood at a crossroads. The rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany posed a direct ideological and territorial threat. The clash between Nazism and communism seemed inevitable, yet in August 1939, the world was stunned by the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement between two bitter enemies. Secret
The Union
protocols
was
divided
now truly
Eastern Europe
underway,
into spheres
with
of
one man,
influence.
Stalin,
Weeks later,
determined to come
Germany
out on
invaded
top.
Poland from the west, and the Red Army marched in from the east. The Second World War had begun. The months that followed, the Soviet Union expanded its borders, annexing the Baltic states and parts of Romania while fighting a costly and controversial war against Finland. Though the Red Army ultimately prevailed in the Winter War, its weaknesses were exposed, weaknesses rooted in the purges that had decimated its officer corps.
And then on January
Nazi
21st,
Germany swept
1924,
across
the
Western
moon-faced,
Europe with
balding
lightning
dictator
speed. By 1941, Hitler had conquered France and stood master of the continent. Only one ideological rival remained. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa shattered the fragile peace. In the largest land invasion in history, millions of German soldiers surged across the Soviet frontier. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in the
25
opening
degree
weeks.
below zero weather.
Cities fell,
It seemed that
millions
everyone
were
wanted to pay
captured,
their
and
last
vast
respects.
territories were lost. The
Stalin
industrial
removed
heartland faced annihilation, yet the Soviet state did not collapse. Factories were dismantled and moved east beyond the Urals. Civilians and soldiers alike were mobilized in a desperate struggle for survival. What began as a war of conquest became a war of extermination, and the Soviet Union would answer with total war. This first chapter sets the stage for the colossal struggle that would define the 20th
Stalin,
century.
Zinoviev,
From
and
the revolutionary
Kamenev forced
zeal
Trotsky.
of Red October to the thunder of German panzers racing toward Moscow, this is the story of a nation forged in upheaval and tested by fire. It is a tale of leaders whose decisions reshaped continents, of ordinary people caught in extraordinary times, and of an ideology that sought to remake the world. Part 1 explores the political intrigue, economic transformation, social
power
upheaval,
output.
and military catastrophe that shaped the Soviet Union's first 2 decades. Through cinematic storytelling and deep historical analysis, we examine how revolution turned into regime, how fear became a tool of governance, and how a state born in chaos prepared, knowingly or not, for the greatest invasion in history. The road from Red October to Barbarossa is one of ambition and tragedy, innovation and oppression, triumph and terror. It is the story of how a revolutionary dream became a superpower, and how that superpower stood on the brink of destruction in the summer of 1941. When Operation Barbarossa exploded across the Soviet frontier on June 22, 1941, the fate of the Soviet Union hung by a thread. Entire armies were swallowed in vast encirclements at Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. Millions of Red Army soldiers were killed or taken
officially
prisoner
recognized
in
on
the
the
opening
world
months.
stage,
The
it
Luftwaffe
continued to have
dominated the
extremely
skies.
tense
German
relationships with
panzer
foreign
divisions
powers.
tore through Soviet defenses with terrifying speed. To many observers around the world, the collapse of the Soviet state seemed inevitable. But what followed would become one of the greatest stories of endurance and total mobilization in modern history. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin, stunned at first by the scale of the betrayal, quickly reasserted control. The Soviet government transformed the conflict into what it called the Great Patriotic War. This was no longer merely an ideological struggle between Nazism and communism. It was a fight for national survival. Factories were dismantled piece by piece and shipped eastward beyond the Ural Mountains. Entire industries were relocated under impossible conditions. Workers labored in freezing temperatures to rebuild production lines from scratch. Within months, tanks, artillery, and aircraft began pouring out of these new industrial centers, demonstrating the staggering capacity of Soviet wartime mobilization. As German forces pushed toward Moscow in the autumn of 1941, the capital braced for siege. Panic swept parts of the city, yet Stalin chose to remain. The Red Army, reinforced by divisions transferred from Siberia after intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack from the
would be the
east,
most efficient way to
prepared for a
mobilize
final
resources.
stand. In December 1941, as temperatures plunged, Soviet forces launched a counteroffensive that drove the exhausted Wehrmacht back from the gates of Moscow. It was the first major strategic defeat suffered by Nazi Germany in the war, shattering the myth of German invincibility. Yet the war was far from won. In 1942, Adolf Hitler shifted his focus southward,
The whole
aiming to seize
of the
oil fields
USSR.
of the Caucasus and cut the Soviet Union off from vital resources. The campaign culminated in the brutal struggle for Stalingrad. For months, the city on the Volga became a furnace of destruction. Street by street, factory by factory, Soviet defenders clung to the ruins. The fighting reduced entire divisions to fragments. Civilians endured bombardment, starvation, and terror. But behind the scenes, Soviet commanders prepared a massive encirclement operation. In November 1942, Operation Uranus slammed into the weaker Axis flanks surrounding the city. Within days, the German Sixth Army was trapped. By February 1943, after months of freezing hardship and failed relief attempts, it surrendered. Stalingrad marked a turning point not just in the Eastern Front, but in the entire war. From that moment forward, the strategic initiative gradually shifted.
How many people are
The Red
permanently
Army
removed
reformed,
from circulation?
learned from
No one
early
knows.
disasters,
In some
and
provinces,
improved
as much as 4
coordination between armor, artillery, and air power. Soviet industry, now fully mobilized, produced staggering numbers of T-34 tanks and Katyusha rocket launchers. In July 1943 came the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. German forces launched a final major offensive in the east, but Soviet defenses were layered, fortified, and ready. When the German attack stalled, the Red Army unleashed a counteroffensive that would never truly stop. Through 1943 and 1944, Soviet forces advanced relentlessly westward. Cities such as Kiev, Minsk, and Smolensk were liberated, though often left in ruins. Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944 destroyed Germany's army
Percent
group
of the
center,
population
inflicting
vanishes.
catastrophic losses. The scale of Soviet
Kamenev and
offensives grew
Zinoviev,
immense,
who helped Stalin,
millions of troops, thousands of tanks, and overwhelming artillery barrages. The war on the Eastern Front became a grinding machine that consumed armies whole. The human cost was staggering. Entire regions had been devastated by occupation and scorched earth policies. Civilians were massacred, deported, or starved. The Holocaust reached horrific depths in the occupied Soviet territories.
Were sentenced in these trials.
Villages were wiped
Their
from the
confessions
map.
were scripted.
As the Red Army
Hundreds of
pushed
people were
west,
invited to
it
witness them.
uncovered
They were covered
evidence
by
of
the
unimaginable atrocities. The war was no longer just about territory, it had become a reckoning. By early 1945, Soviet forces stood on the Oder River, within striking distance of Berlin. The final offensive began in April. Fighting was fierce and unrelenting. Street combat turned the German capital into rubble. Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag in May 1945, symbolizing the collapse of the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler was dead. Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally. Victory came at an immense price. The Soviet Union had lost tens of millions of soldiers and civilians, a toll unparalleled in modern warfare. Entire cities lay in ruins. Yet the Red Army now occupied much of Eastern Europe. The Soviet state emerged not as a shattered victim, but as one of two global superpowers. From the ashes of devastation rose a new geopolitical reality that would shape the second half of the 20th century. Part 2 chronicles the transformation of the Soviet Union from a nation on the brink of destruction to the force that crushed Nazi Germany. It is a story of resilience under unimaginable pressure, of industrial miracles forged in exile, of brutal sacrifices and strategic brilliance. It examines how fear was replaced by fierce patriotism, how ideology fused with survival, and how a war of annihilation became the foundation of Soviet superpower status. From the frozen fields outside Moscow to the burning streets of Berlin, this chapter captures the relentless drive of a nation determined not merely to survive, but to prevail.
We're convinced, oh, if he
When the
says he's
guns fell
guilty, he must be
silent in
guilty.
May 1945,
a very few of
the
Yezhov's
Soviet
victims
Union
are
stood
given
victorious,
trials.
but scarred beyond comprehension. Entire cities lay in ruins, from Stalingrad to Sevastopol. Tens of millions were dead. Yet from this devastation emerged a state more powerful than ever before. The Red Army occupied Eastern Europe. Communist governments began taking shape across Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. What had begun in 1917 as a
Next
revolutionary
case, in
experiment was
1938,
now a global
Yezhov himself
force.
is purged, together
Under
with many
Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union wasted no time consolidating its new sphere of influence. Wartime alliances with the United States and Britain dissolved quickly, replaced by suspicion and ideological confrontation. Winston Churchill would soon describe an iron curtain descending across Europe. The Cold War had begun. The late 1940s and early 1950s were years of reconstruction and militarization. Soviet industry, already proven capable of wartime miracles, rebuilt shattered cities and expanded heavy production. At the same time, nuclear research accelerated. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, ending the American monopoly on nuclear weapons and dramatically escalating global tensions.
Absolute master
The
of the
arms
Soviet
race
Union.
was
He had
underway.
simply wiped out
Stalin's
anyone
final
who could
years were
challenge his
marked by renewed paranoia. Political repression intensified. The security apparatus remained omnipresent. Yet when Stalin died in 1953, A power struggle followed, one that would ultimately elevate Nikita Khrushchev. Unlike his predecessor, Khrushchev denounced aspects of Stalin's rule in his secret speech of 1956, exposing the terror of the purges and initiating a period known as de-Stalinization. The Soviet Union entered a more complex era, still authoritarian, but less dominated by mass terror. Internationally, the Cold War deepened. The Soviet Union backed communist movements abroad and solidified the Warsaw Pact as a military counterweight to NATO. The Hungarian uprising of 1956 demonstrated
stopping to
that
turn up for
Moscow
work,
would not
and
tolerate
Stalin decided to
rebellion
get rid
within
of him.
its sphere.
So the Great
Tanks
Terror came to a
rolled
fairly
into
sudden
Budapest to
end
crush dissent,
towards
reinforcing Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Yet the Soviet system also achieved remarkable technological triumphs. In 1957, Sputnik became the first artificial satellite launched into space, stunning the world and igniting the space race. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth, becoming the first human in space, a monumental propaganda victory.
To meet with his Soviet equivalent,
science and engineering
Vyacheslav
stood at the
Molotov.
forefront of global
A
achievement,
pact between the two
symbolizing
nations
the promise of socialism's modern future. But beneath these achievements lay systemic weaknesses. Centralized planning struggled with inefficiencies. Consumer goods lagged behind Western standards. Agricultural production remained inconsistent. By the mid-1960s, Leonid Brezhnev replaced Khrushchev, ushering in a long period often described as stagnation. Stability
In the end,
returned, but
Stalin's
innovation
predictions
slowed.
about the
The leadership
timetable of the war in
prioritized
Europe
military
would
parity
prove
with the United States,
disastrously
pouring
wrong.
vast resources into defense and global influence. The Cold War reached dangerous peaks, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to proxy wars in Africa and Asia. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 would prove especially costly, draining resources and morale while exposing the limits of Soviet power. At home, economic pressures mounted. Oil revenues temporarily masked structural inefficiencies, but deeper problems persisted within the command economy. By the 1980s, the need for reform was undeniable. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to leadership with ambitious plans to revitalize the system. His policies of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost openness aimed to modernize the economy and increase transparency.
Military missions
For the first
arrived to
time in
confer with the
decades,
Soviet
public
government.
debate expanded.
So did German
Censorship
representatives.
loosened. Long-suppressed grievances surfaced across the Union's diverse republics. Yet reform unleashed forces that could not be easily controlled. Economic disruptions intensified shortages. Nationalist movements gained strength in the Baltic states, the Caucasus, and beyond. The authority of the Communist Party weakened. In 1989, as revolutions swept Eastern Europe, Soviet-backed regimes
fronts
collapsed one
trying
by
to rally
one.
all
The
socialists and
Berlin
all
Wall
moderates.
fell. The Iron Curtain dissolved. In 1991, a failed hardline coup attempt in Moscow further destabilized the system. Republic after republic declared independence. By December of that year, the Soviet Union formally dissolved. The red flag that had flown over the Kremlin for nearly 70 years was lowered for the last time. The story
August
that began with
21st,
the storming of the
1939,
Winter Palace in
the world was
1917
set on its
ended
heels
not
by the
with
announcement of a
invasion,
treaty
but with
between
internal unraveling. A state that had survived civil war, famine, purges, and the largest invasion in history ultimately fell to economic strain, political rigidity, and the centrifugal pull of nationalism. Part 3 traces the Soviet Union's transformation from victorious superpower to fragile giant, and finally to dissolution. It examines how
Kharkov,
ideology
taking everything
shaped global
before him,
politics for
before
nearly half a
the
century.
Russians started
How
to sort of
fear and
gather a proper
ambition built a
resistance and
military
started to fight.
colossus,
Before
and
then,
how reform
it looked
exposed
like
deep
everything was
structural
collapsing.
cracks.
And Stalin
It
himself
reflects on the
said,
paradox of a
Lenin
system
left us a
capable of
state.
defeating Nazi Germany and reaching space, yet unable to sustain itself in a changing world.